Many thanks for that, Christian, and to the Sunday papers as usual. This is one of those days when the night news editors, if there are still night news editors, I don't know, can't agree on what the main story is. The Observer has calls for a new era of airport security after the Sinai terror. We'll be talking about that with the Foreign Secretary certainly later on. Now, I love The Independent. It's jolly well edited. I like its editors very much indeed. But I have to say, guys, in terms of gripping front page headlines on a Sunday morning, it's 50-50 that no one was watching CCTV doesn't quite make it. Never mind, there's the Scotland on Sunday front page, which is very interesting for the future. Alex and other SNP leaders are calling for Holyrood to get the power to call another indie referendum, which would make it, of course, much more likely to happen. Mail on Sunday has Hewitt. They've missed the word rat. They always have the word rat with Hewitt on the front page. But Hewitt caught selling Diana and William letters. They're very angry about that. The Sunday Express will be talking about jet bombers spoke with British accents, they say. And finally, there's the Sunday Times. Very, very wealthy men, in this case footballers, have had their money bilked from them by fraudsters. Well, there's a shocking story. Anyway, on to all of this. It is, of course, Remembrance Sunday, Isabel, and you have a beautiful photograph from, I think, Liverpool there.
Yes, it's inside the Sunday Telegraph, and it's of those beautiful ceramic poppies that were spilling out of the Tower of London last year and are now spilling out of St George's Hall in Liverpool. And it was such a beautiful and moving remembrance tribute last year that it would have been a shame not to use it again year after year, and to see it in another part of the country is just an example of what a good piece of art it was, because it was popular, people flocked to see it, people flocked in London to see it, and now they can flock to see it in Liverpool as well.
Diane, we were talking earlier on, you're quite shocked by a story, I think in the Express, about the Merchant Navy not getting the proper attendance at invitations at the Remembrance Ceremony.
Absolutely. I think
like UKIP, of course.
Well, yes, let's just put the UKIP aspect slightly aside. We're talking about men and women who gave their lives, who supplied the United Kingdom as part of the war effort. Without those individuals, and they took huge losses in terms of ships and submarines and whatever sunk, and to see them excluded from the Remembrance Sunday celebrations, I think is a very, very bad mark on behalf of this government.
Particularly, we've just had a new book out by Jonathan Dimbleby, which suggests the Battle of the Atlantic was the single most important battle in the Second World War. Without that, everything would have gone the other way.
Absolutely. You know, these boats were bringing fuel, they were bringing wood, metal, everything that contributed to the war effort, and huge numbers of sailors died when those ships were sunk. As I say, I think we're looking at a degree of discrimination here, and it's unfair, and we really need to recognise the whole war effort, all of the people that were involved, all of the units that were involved, and not just be very selective.
Adrian, of course, the big story, the big news story this morning remained the downing of the Russian jet. You've got the front page of the Express there, I mentioned earlier on.
Yes, this is a story that says that the jihadis who were celebrating maybe the bombing of this airplane were celebrating with Birmingham accents.
Good grief. And this is intelligence chatter picked up from the air, we think.
Or just from the Sunday Express backbench. Yes, I mean...
No.
I mean, nobody really... There doesn't seem to be any hard news about any of it at the moment. There's an awful lot of speculation and an awful lot of stuff that's coming out of unnamed sources.
But there are some tough questions, Isabel. The Telegraph's got a big spread on this.
Yes, it's got a really useful briefing inside the paper on the 6 key questions about the holiday jet bombing. It's very useful for anyone who's finding this crisis slightly confusing. It's also got some very good comment from Edward Lucas on the Russian position on this. We obviously saw an about turn from Russia at the end of last week, where Putin initially was criticising David Cameron for suspending British flights and then did exactly the same with Russian flights.
And we think the Russians have just hit Raqqa, where ISIS are based, of course.
Well, that was the next question, was what are the Russians going to do next? Are they going to retreat from their attacks in Syria?
I think we know what Russians do next, is they bomb. They bomb again. Yes. OK, well, let's move on to a little bit of domestic politics, and the EU reform story is everywhere, Diane. You'd be surprised for me to ask you about that. But David Cameron is coming out this week with some quite tough words, saying, if I don't get what I want, I will lead the Out campaign. Do you believe him?
No, I don't. I mean, this is the usual tough stance that David Cameron always wants to put across. I can see you smiling, but, by the same token, the UKIP MEPs, and I'm sure a vast proportion of the Eurosceptic voters out there, will also be looking at this with a degree of cynicism, sarcasm maybe, and also just amusement. that here he is, and the quotes are made, he's walking a tightrope. We know the Prime Minister wants to stay in. He's made no secret of that. He's actually saying, you know, I'm going to go and ask, I've supposedly got some very tough demands, but actually my backstop position is to stay in.
You're nodding, Isabel, you agree with this?
Well, The Sun have got a headline saying, Cam, I'm showing Brussels muscle, and then a Photoshop of him as Jean-Claude Van Cam. But yes, he's sort of playing good cop, bad cop with himself at the moment. So a few weeks ago, he was saying the idea that Britain could be like Norway was not the sort of land of milk and honey, but actually now he's saying he is prepared to leave, even though we know that his instincts are to stay in. And as Diane says, Eurosceptics don't believe that, but also those who are waiting to hear from him, to hear what he actually wants from his renegotiation, are starting to get a little impatient because they haven't really heard any detail that's particularly encouraging or that suggests there might be a point where he would walk away.
This is the question. Are we going to get the detail? Are we actually going to see the detail about what we're asking for in terms of the 4-year ban on migrants getting in work benefits and those kind of things? If it's not there, then there'll be a lot more suspicion, I guess.
And I think you know, you've hit the nail on the head there. If we go back over the last few weeks and even few months, there's been a consistent message coming from other European leaders to say, no, David, no, that's non-negotiable. No,
that's illegal.
Exactly. In some cases, illegal, unlawful, it's contrary to a treaty and such. We've had an admission this week that treaty change isn't possible. So, you know, a lot of what David Cameron is trying to set out hasn't got the critical foundation that could then allow him to deliver it.
Adrian, apart from food, television, refugees, foreign affairs stories, he used to write about politics quite a lot. Would you give David Cameron a bit of a pass on this?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that he's in an invidious position, and that, you know, you have to go into a negotiation appearing that you've got a stick, but actually I think he's using his carrot as a stick, if you see what I mean.
No, I'm not sure. I think I do, yes.
I mean, he really just wants us to stay in, and I think, and I happen to agree with him on that, I want to stay in as well, but I think that there will be more agreement from a lot of the smaller countries in Europe for some of the things that he wants. I mean, I've just been travelling through the Balkans doing the refugees coming from Kos, and there's an awful lot of really fundamental dislike of what's happening in Berlin and in Paris, and there's the other.
So it's a moment for playing clever. One could possibly get alliances of the smaller countries together.
I think so. I think we tend to look too much towards Germany for what the European community thinks.
Let's jump on to another of the big stories, Corbyn and Trident. Adrian, I think you've got a thing on that as well. Maria Eagle, I beg your pardon. Maria Eagle is coming on later on, the new Shadow Defence spokesman, to talk about this.
Well, yes, then she'll know more about it than I do, because apparently, or indeed Mr. Corbyn, who apparently hasn't met her yet, or met her to talk about Trident.
Talk about this.
They may have talked about other things.
Absolutely.
But he looked very uncomfortable yesterday at the Royal Albert Hall for the Poppy Day.
Is there a sort of element of gentle media bullying going on of a chap who...
Nothing gentle about it.
Nothing gentle about it, yes. You know, he has to wear a boiled white starched collar and a bow tie and kneel and wear the right poppies and say the right things, or will be beastly to him.
But this is Michael Foot all over again.
Yeah, it really is, isn't it? And of course it's going to be very important for UKIP in the election. Nigel Farage is doing an awful lot of hammering of Jeremy Corbyn for not being patriotic enough, and he's apparently going to read a poem and so forth today to demonstrate that he is.
Yes, and I mean, you know, with the background, obviously, of the Oldham by-election, the fact that this is the first election test, not only for Labour and Jeremy Corbyn, but also for the Tory party. You know, we've got the aspects that, you know, George Osborne being defeated on tax credits and such. We've got the rollout of the universal credit. This is a test not just, as I say, for the Labour Party, although, of course, the Tory party would like to focus on that. It's a whole test, first critical test since the general election. Exactly. You know, and if we can turn what was a huge amount of support, although we only got one MP, into a second MP, that would be absolutely fabulous news from UKIP's point of view. But for the Tories, if they can seriously bury Jeremy Corbyn with this by-election, that'll be a win-win for them.
So it's going to be a very important one, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
And if Labour, though, can actually survive this and retain the seat, then, of course, Jeremy Corbyn's safe for some considerable time to come.
And Isabel, in terms of what's going on inside the Tory party and all of this, Diane was mentioning tax credits. And as he searches for money, George Osborne is homing in on Ian Duncan Smith's budget for universal credit. And if the papers are all right, there's lots of briefing in the papers, he is boiling with anger about this and even on the edge of resignation.
Yes, well, George Osborne has never been fully supportive of universal credit. He was quite suspicious of it when Ian Duncan Smith was developing it, partly because he thought it had a sort of evangelical theme to it, and Osborne's quite suspicious of that sort of that way of making policy according to beliefs. But in this row, Owen Paterson has weighed in favour of Ian Duncan Smith, saying that George Osborne can't go for universal credit. The headline says, "Tax credits fiasco is your fault, George, so hands off Ian Duncan Smith's billions." And there is a suspicion within Westminster that Osborne blames Ian Duncan Smith for the tax credits row as well.
Oh, really?
And that actually it's somehow Ian Duncan Smith's fault, which is something
buckets of bad blood in that case.
Yes, I can't fully understand that given this was George Osborne's idea, but I'm sure it all makes sense within the Treasury.
Adrian, we don't plug anything on this programme, as you know very well. Nonetheless, you have written a very, very interesting memoir about your ups and downs over the years, the drinking and the writing of columns of different kinds. But one of the things in it that really struck me is how much time you have spent in the sort of darker places of the world looking at refugee crises. And you're saying, again, you've just been down following people from Kos. With that in mind, there's a story, I think, in the Sunday Telegraph today saying the EU is trying to do a deal with Africa, whereby they're going to send back lots and lots of illegal African immigrants in return for doctors and engineers and nurses.
The most depressing story, even if it's a tiny bit true. It's really ghastly, the idea that we would say to developing countries in Africa, look, we'll give you all the people we really don't need or don't want here, and but can you give us all the people you really do need? All the doctors, the engineers,
the really talented,
we bring them over here, we'll educate them and we'll use them.
And we don't care very much what happens to you in the meantime.
It's the most cynical and appalling way of manufacturing more refugees, actually.
Yeah, terrible, terrible. On a slightly lighter note, the John Lewis advert. There's no easy segue from one to the other.
Such a disappointment.
Every year now.
It's the big moment for the beginning of Christmas, is that you wait for the John Lewis ad. It's become a thing.
When did this happen? I mean, it used to be Christmas carols and snowmen and all that. Now it's the John Lewis ad.
And now it appears to be an ad suggesting that you send your demented old people to the moon. And that what you then give lonely people as a Christmas present is a telescope so that they can see at a distance other people having fun.
It's very bleak, isn't it?
It is supposed to be raising awareness of loneliness amongst the elderly, but I wonder whether it might become one of those sort of virtue signalling things where people go around saying, "Oh, I wept at the John Lewis advert, it's incredibly sad," yet they don't visit any elderly relatives as a result of it, or maybe even connect with older people in their communities.
But they're in a home which might as well be the moon, as far as many people.
Yes, and they see everyone else having a lovely Christmas, as the poor old man does in the John Lewis advert, and then they get sent a telescope so they can see it in greater detail while still being lonely.
It is very strange, isn't it? It's the ultimate triumph of the consumer society, he said in the Jeremy Corbyn-esque way. Listen, thank you all very much indeed. That was a fascinating newspaper review, as we'd hoped for. And to the weather. Where have the crisp autumn days gone? It's been wet,